Well, when I was first invited to give this talk, I thought, heretical? Me? Me? I'm no Joan of Arc. Don't heretics get burnt at the stake? I work in an academic institution, and you could argue that it's impossible as well to be a heretic whilst within the academy. But thinking about the origin of the word heretic and this idea of choice, having a choice to find your own path, take your own route into something. And this idea of choice is going to be the cornerstone, I suppose, of my talk today. So choice is at the heart of being heretical. How you go about making sound, designing circuits, the freedom to choose your own path, whether this is an interpretation of religious texts or a means to create sound synthesis. This talk offers some reflection on heresy in relation to, I've separated this, heresy, sound and synthesis, rather than this heretical sound synthesis. I'm trying to break these things up a little bit. I feel a bit safer there. I like to think of this talk as in episodes. It's maybe non-linear. There may be some random elements, and I'll move from one thing to the next. I might not make any direct conclusions about what I mean by some of the episodes in relation to heresy, and I'll leave that up to you to make your own interpretations. So, the title of this talk, 101 Ways to Make the Sound or whatever. In the centre of this picture is John Bowers, very interesting academic, currently at Newcastle University, who I've worked with on many occasions. And we did a rehearsal, and we spent a week together working on what we called a curated research project, where we brought together a team, a group, if you like, of musicians, artists, thinkers, to respond to a theme. And the theme for this particular event was one knob to rule them all. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But at the rehearsal, after the week of intensive making and practicing, we laughed. We said, all this effort, and we've got, you're doing it with all your analogue circuits job, and I've got my PD patch, and Tim's got his modular synth, and we chuckled. Yes, perhaps we are aiming for the same sort of sounds. But I'm not here in any way discrediting the idea that there are differences. And again, the journey which we took to achieve these different sounds is very important. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of these journeys. Yeah, these episodes will be numbered between 1 and 101. This is number 12. 12 Dixon Drive, Leicester. I'm from Leicester. Actually, I live in Leicester. Here it is. It's an ordinary street in an ordinary town. But on this street used to live a poet laureate, Philip Larkin, who died in early 2000. But one of his first jobs was a librarian at Leicester University. And he lived in number 12 with his mother. It's not a particularly glamorous place. He then went on, he got a job in Belfast, and then he got even promoted into a higher position at the University of Hull. And he became a celebrated poet. There's a picture of him. Now, Larkin does have some views I don't agree with. But there was one particular poem that kind of stuck with me. His poetry was kind of thrust upon school pupils as part of the curriculum to study, so it wasn't my choice in that regard. I was thrust Philip Larkin, and one poem which seems to stick in my mind and resonate, partly because I live in Leicester, and this is not so far away from where I live, and thinking about heresy, this idea of somewhere else, the importance of elsewhere. So Hull is not Berlin. It's not Paris. It's not even Helsinki. It's somewhere else. And he wrote this poem, actually is referring to his time in Belfast. But he talks, and it's the last stanza here of this poem, but he talks about how being outside of the school, if you like, is liberating. And as you can see from the lines there, by being elsewhere, you can be freed from what you might consider cultural norms. The weight of expectation may be relieved from your shoulders. This also takes me to a composer, Maya Verlaque, who was actually at The Hague. And she just finished a PhD called Hexenhaus. I think she was very inspired by the Hague School. And Hex is, I think, an old German word for witch. And in her PhD, she also talked about creating some kind of space or place on the periphery. And from that point, she would then scrutinize the establishment or whatever from within. Her particular work, Maya Verlaque, talks about things like witchcraft electronics and composing from on the fence or beyond the fence. So, let's get into some sounds. This radical chip, as I call it, is a collaboration with a Swedish musician and artist called Max Wainwright. We've worked together on numerous occasions. He seems to push me in a good direction, and I push him in a good direction. And one of the things that I've really enjoyed doing is working with limitations. So this particular synthesis is very much restricted by the limitations that I impose on myself. So the radical chip was an idea to create a synthesis using a direct digital synthesis, DDS, but on possibly one of the cheapest microprocessors. So there it is, the PIC 12F1822 or 1840, similar architecture. Reasons for using this particular chip: it was very cheap, and it also had an internal clock of 20 megahertz. So that enabled us to work with direct digital synthesis and also design our own DAC, digital to analog converter. This is another feeling I enjoy, or particular desire I have often with synthesis, that I want to get a kind of lower level. Low-level programming, hands-on. Even the idea of dirty electronics really refers to that. It's about something that is from the roots, something that's kind of earthy. And we may, from this, think about a sort of low-level engagement with the technology or the material. I'll play a bit, shall I? I'll switch a couple of them on. Let's see. Takes you into a world that, for me, I'm not a coder, I'm not a programmer. So this idea of being confronted with sort of low-level programming language is frightening. But I kind of get a kick out of it. And there's something about the naivety of it, which I also find creative. There's lots of naive art. Naive in that, well, I say it's a kind of low technology, but this particular pick, even though it's 50 cents, is not really low fidelity or lo-fi. It's still a very sophisticated microprocessor. But also naivety in my abilities as a kind of coder. Once the initial architecture is set up, which does take some knowledge in terms of programming some of the microprocessors, then having a kind of a non-technical almost approach to thinking about how the code is arranged. So of course it's using a sort of wavetable synthesis, but because it's a microprocessor here, there's an opportunity to change the speed of the clock and a number of other mathematical issues in terms of how the sound is controlled. I also like this idea of thinking about coding in a non sort of text-based way. So both of these objects here, you can change parts of the waveform or the way in which the code is read through some analog devices, like a microphone. You'll notice as I turned up the sound, it started changing the way, changing the algorithm essentially, due to a microphone, and also changing the way in which the synthesis was happening in kind of real time. Similarly with touch. Some people call this tangible kind of coding, but to the musician that opens up another set of possibilities. We don't necessarily have to know that it's a wavetable and what type of synthesis is going on, but we can use our ear and it becomes a little bit more intuitive. Like my talk, I kind of gravitated towards this more sort of episodic compositional style. Yeah, press a button and it takes you somewhere else. Technology seems to, particularly the sort of technology I delight in playing with, lends itself to that sort of structuring. But that's partly due to, in the past, trying to think about how you may slowly evolve a sound. But the idea of a sudden change in parameter will often take the style or the sound to something or somewhere completely new. And also this idea of not knowing exactly where I'm going to go with these things. So lots of random parameters. Why do you need to press a button and go up through the presets? Would it just not be more fun to just press a button and you just get something you're not expecting? Or it sounds obvious, but yeah. So these particular devices kind of sum up that approach. Back to this idea of limitations. This novel, if you like, by George Perec, is a lipograph. The entire novel is written without the letter E. And when you think about that, you think, God, that must be really hard. But what a way, what a creative device, that kind of idea of imposing a limitation on yourself. And I think if one was heretical, these kind of impositions, if you like, can help us become heretical. You're forced out of your habits, and you have to become something else. You have to adapt. You have to find a new way of going about your creative work. And I feel drawn to the miniature, the haiku, or the aphorism. So how would you describe this, the aphorism? Small statement, kind of big meaning. Likewise with some of the technology. You could say, well, John, you can do wavetable synthesis on your computer. But it's not the same. I like the limitations I've imposed on myself. That picture I don't know how to code it. I don't know what the DAC is going to do. And then composing inside electronics, a David Tudor phrase, is something that also appeals to me. That does become very much like a composition, not just synthesis. I'll digress here. This is not on my slides, but the idea of synthesis I find problematic sometimes, because to me the electronic sounds that I hear are themselves. So this idea of synthesis being somehow close to synthetic or simulating something. The etymology of the word synthesis means to place next to or to compose, actually. But we often kind of think of the history of synthesizers in particular as somehow simulating other sounds, or electronic sound not being natural, or all those sorts of things. And I suppose one particular approach in my work is to not think like that. That this is this is it. You know, this is the sound. It's not synthesized. It is a sound, and that's kind of important in terms of hierarchy and democracy of the sounds around us. Often, electronic sound is a poorer cousin of the playing second fiddle. So, yes, I've digressed there. But I've also done some more rustic things with analog electronics. Again, using, I like nails and bits of wood and wire, and trying to explore different materials. Very simple things, just like an oscillator in a can, or it's not much, but make some good music with this. I had that on my desk, and I've got a PhD in composition, and I didn't take this very seriously. But how wrong I was. I should have been more aware of the potential of little simple things. I was probably influenced by Cage, this idea of be a bit more zen about things. We could make some good music with that. And I would give this to various composers. Pauline Oliveros, bless her, before she died, we did a piece with this. There's a text score in a book, an anthology of text scores, a piece written for a number of these instruments. And Howard Skempton, who was in the Scratch Orchestra. Merzbow, the Japanese noise musician. And there I am. If I drop down dead during this talk, that PDF folder on my laptop is probably worth more than anything. It's the compositions that people have written for this little tin oscillator, very simple oscillator with a tin can. So I'm drawn to the elemental things. There's Nicholas Collins's, of course, the world's simplest oscillator, isn't there, in the hardware hacking book. And John Bowers again, in that book as well, he talks about the Victorian synthesizer. I think often of electronic music as the Holy Trinity. And you've got electricity, maybe an amplifier and a speaker. Could we pare it down to just one or two things? A kind of reductionist approach. I'm somehow drawn to that, maybe because I'm lazy. or maybe it's efficiency. So I could say 101 ways to make an oscillator. One of my students has this term, modular dads, he talks about. These are slightly middle-aged people, probably like myself actually, who've got far too much money to spend all their wages on modular synthesizers. The modular dad. Yeah, how many oscillators do you need? Is the question. But here's another little oscillator. This is just a relay and a battery, but the capacitor can change the speed of the oscillation and how quickly it switches on and off. Lower frequency. Very simple oscillator with off-the-shelf relay switch and a capacitor of different sizes and battery. So I'm drawn to this way of making electronic sound. And of course it's very Alvin Lucier as well, isn't it? You've got materials you can. I had a lot of motors, and I thought, oh yeah, they're great motors. They're so closely related to the loudspeaker. Well, John Bowers, the Victorian synthesizer, he argued that the Victorians could have invented the synthesizer because they had electromagnetic induction and magnets and copper. And their motors are amazing things, often discarded. A pile of motors, could I do something with my Arduino, or could I generate current with them, etc. But it did occur to me, why don't I just plug it into the PA? This is a little bit heretical, actually, I think, but it sounds great. So this also has a pair of scissor handles attached to the motor shaft. But it's quite a good, very... Not even got a battery. It's really cool. And each motor, DC or stepper, they all produce different waveforms. Some of them do produce DC. You can fiddle about trying to filter that out, or but each motor moves that's proper analog electronics, that is. Motor turns, speaker moves. Here's another one. This is just It also presents a lot of other challenges, in that you can find the hardest way to play it. The harder the better, you see. I kind of sort of slippery bows. I'm quite into that sort of. But I'm not even sure if that is synthesis. It's so direct. Or maybe it's synthesis in my mind. And now all these, they all have some kind of gestures ultimately associated with it. I studied with Trevor Wishart up at York University. Trevor's famous on sonic art book. It's a great text, hard to read. Trevor seemed to put his entire life into that book. If you've ever tried to read it, particularly the first edition, it will take you a while, especially with it's all typed down. But there was one, I think actually it was the book after that, with the audio examples.
Audible design.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. Where he took the envelope of like a snare drum and superimposed that on the voice. It's a classic thing to do, isn't it? And you realise that the attack and the energy, the envelope, has a huge impact on the way in which we hear a sound. If you did that kind of envelope mapping, if you like, and taking the envelope of one sound and superimposing it on another, and you get the sound of the voice sounded like a snare drum, or vice versa, simply in the information in the amplitude. And this is true with these motors. When I'm playing it like this, the actual content of the sound or the waveform itself is hugely influenced by the action. And so the motors do provide a really good way of generating electronic sound, very direct. And vibrating things. This is another simple instrument with it's just another motor. But you could maybe. So that's just a motor, and tick and vibration and. I've written a spoof manifesto with Max Wainwright on this. It's very pixelated. Microcomputer music. Yeah. It's not the same as composing electronic music using a laptop. Very much conditioned by the limitations. And you can find that online on the Dirty Electronics website. But back to code. I am interested in convergence because of data. When you start creating data and tables, what you can, as the previous talk demonstrated, you can do a lot of things with the data. And a good friend of mine said, you're an academic, you make these kind of graphical looking synthesizers, objects. Why don't you make an object that is your next publication, I suppose. So instead of writing a paper at a conference, I could just store it all on a picture. Yeah! It doesn't even have to make sound, but it's just another depository for ideas. And I started working on some PIC-based group of synthesizers, and I got to interview Frieder Naka. He's in his 80s. He's a professor. He's a retired professor in Bremen, and he took part in the famous Cyber Serendipity exhibition at the ICA in the 1960s, and he's one of the first artists, shall we say, in the 1960s who's associated with computer art. So his work is exhibited at the Tate, for example. And this is an example of one of the pieces, one of the earlier works. So I thought it'd be really nice to get him to write some code or talk about making music with code on like a synthesizer or an object. So on this group of synthesizers, there's a long interview. It's only an interview, it doesn't make any sound necessarily. You've got to find it in the code, and actually it's the comments. So it's not really uploaded onto the chip anyway. But the only way you could access it is to get into the code itself. I think it's probably one of my least read publications. I think it scares a lot of people off. But I do say you can just read it in a text editor. And people go, but if you download the code to that, there's some very interesting interviews about working with sound, computer art, and storing things on a microprocessor. Heretical. Similarly, with this object here, it was for a protest. So we had this idea that you could store a manifesto on a kind of microprocessor, and then you could simple text to waveform interpretation of that. But I particularly like the idea of storing other things on some of these synths, shall we say, which we can't hear it necessarily, but it's there. Yeah, so I've talked about that. I've talked about the motors and the relays. And I'll probably take me on to the next, coming to the next slide. Also, I think the theme I keep coming back to is it's not just about the sound. I have spent my entire life, I think as a musician, I think I can use that term, and I spent so many hours thinking about the sound, which is probably a good thing, but the relationships with all of these devices and objects, my relationship to synthesis, for example, is what my heresy is founded on. I think I'm not going to throw anything to you in this talk. I'm constantly asking people to approach the sounds in different ways. So putting an instrument out of reach so you can't touch it, creating something unergonomic. Now that just seems contrite, but it's like another type of limitation, isn't it? Where by having something that's awkward, this is digressing slightly away from synthesis here, but by having something awkward, your relationship to that sound will nevertheless change. So this idea of a relational setting, and how you approach making those sounds with that object or with that computer. That also does extend to the listener as well, of course. It would be difficult to talk about sound synthesis without the listener involved here. And some of my most heretical works have been what I call non-electronic. So if you come to a gig, you would expect a lot of electronic sound and noise, but of course you can use other things. You can create relative concepts. So acoustic sounds, electronic, which is different to acoustic, because a non-electronic sound can only exist in a kind of a relationship. This idea of introducing an acoustic sound in a particular context only works for me if it's in that context of electronic sound or synthesis. But then, of course, it becomes heretical because everybody's not. It becomes a surprise, or maybe it won't become a surprise. And I've been also interested in a method, I suppose. Here. It's another method which could kind of work with sound synthesis. This dialectical opposites sounds a bit convoluted, but which is borrowed actually from classical rhetoric. You set up the kind of limits of your endeavour or your argument. So you could have black and you could have white. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're just interested in black and white, of course. You know, there's, through this idea of dialectical opposites, you can then investigate what's going on in between. And in this recent book on design, actually, this is Anthony Dunn, who was at the Royal College of Art. Speculative everything. With Fiona Radley, they in the world of design here, they've created these polar opposites. And likewise, this idea of electronic or non-electronic, ergonomic, non-ergonomic, digital, analog, you know, all of these different extremes, if you like, have helped me be rigorous with some of the things that I've done as a method. But yeah, this is not exclusive to the world of design. As I've mentioned, it exists in classical rhetoric. George Brecht's Water Yam is a fantastic piece, a Fluxus piece. It also takes you out of, you know, gives you another way of thinking about it. We could also apply this to, like I said, synthesis. So the Water Yam work is a collection of cards, but he will create these unusual juxtapositions. Bark in Brazil, you know, that's pretty strange. Dance music and gunshot. Yeah. There's oblique strategies, of course. Brian Eno did a similar thing with the. So I like this kind of these kind of opposites in the context of sound synthesis as well. Again, it's another type of approach or limitation I'm imposing on myself when I go to make or create sound. And even in my own practice, I've had a bit of fun and games trying to set up my own oppositions. Some of them slightly digress from synthesis, but all these things are kind of current in my work. Speculative sound circuits. Well, if Anthony Dunn can do it, you know, I can do it as well. So let's just have synthesis. Wavetable synthesis. Calculator. Something like that. So I've tried to create some kind of electronic pieces or synthesis where I'm speculative. I've just tried randomly. This doesn't actually really work because you never can pick things off the shelf. And then just throw them together. Give it to someone else. It's another way of being heretical because it's not actually me doing it. So in this case, calculator, it was meets this nail instrument. I haven't even done any research, but it's purely speculative as a method for sound synthesis. And yeah, the results are quite interesting. I might play a little bit of that later. But yes, this is back to the ergonomics. This is Mr. Happy and Mr. Angry. Of course, Mr. Angry is pretty hard to hold in play. And, okay, I'm moving on. I knew I could talk for this long. Oh, that's come to the end nearly. So let me just have a quick recap on some of these things. Yes, relational aesthetic. I'm particularly interested in, let's take this a little bit further. I talked about John Bowers and the Victorian synthesizer and the world's simplest oscillator, but there's Jonathan Kemp and Martin House's work, where they're the crystal world. I don't know if you know Martin House, but again, this idea of earth and technology. This is a kind of dialectic, if you like, that he acts out in his work. Also reducing electronics to the bare components, so the crystal world, where they try to extract copper and minerals and make their own components. You know, that is a very extreme case of reductionism. And this artist, Osvaldo Sibilis, he uses a monotron, which is kind of so bog standard, isn't it? Yeah, that's here I am talking about synthesis with a very standard sort of synthesizer. But how he changes his relationship is a lot of fun, and certainly food for thought. Let's see if we can get this up. Right, I'm not sure which one. Mini jack. Do you know what channel mini jacks are? Tape, is it?
Data sound from HDMI.
Yeah, it should be there. Oh.
No, I go into the HDMI. The sound preferences that is sent down to the.
What? Obviously not. Anyway, his name is in my abstract. You can track it down, but it involves playing the most common synthesizers in unusual context, with a washing board attached to his hands, apples on his head, and playing with an ironing board, and all of the movements and the gestures change the sound and the music quite significantly. So I'm very interested in his work as well. I think I should conclude with, I make a lot of my own things. I'm very driven by this idea of making your own devices. One of the reasons for that is back to this idea of grassroots and possibly shaping something in your own image, or at least having the potential to do that. When we adopt, I think that's the good word, when we adopt a piece of software or an instrument, we are adopting many of the constraints by the designer. In theory, of course, this is only an ideal, but if we could make something in ourselves, in our own image, we have the potential to liberate ourselves and be heretical. So this idea of making for me is not just to have another synthesizer, but in the act of doing it, I can choose my own path. And on that path, I can perhaps be called an heretical sound synthesist, something like that. Thank you.
Well, we're perfectly on schedule. Thank you, John. Perfect timing. Doesn't sound like the right thing in there. Pitch perfect having, but okay. But yes. So questions.
Yeah, that was quite inspiring. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about maybe how something like DAC design might lead to creative processes, or like how that might.
Yeah. I will give you a demonstration. There's probably some people in this room who could explain this better, but you need a filter essentially. Just a good filter. But on an object like this, space is limited. So the digital waveform is using pulse width modulation. And the frequency of that waveform is high, which is limited by the clock speed of the microprocessor. So the higher I can get it, the less strong the filter for the DAC has to be, which is great. So I can maybe get away with a first order filter. You still, when you look at the waveform, you kind of look on the oscilloscope, it's a little bit stepped, but the higher the frequency, the less strong the filter has to be. And you can get away in this case with a first order filter, which is simply a resistor and a capacitor. But if you start increasing the, let's shall we say, the capacitor and the cutoff point, it becomes slower. So there's a bit of time the capacitor in that resistor capacitive filter takes to charge. So you get a slight gliss if you want to just use a first order, very simple filter. But of course that can be quite cool. You can create a glissandi. So on this synthesizer, I've got different size capacitors on the DAC, and then with a simple jumper, you can have a slow filter, a large cap, which then glides to the next sound. I could try this. Shall I try?
Yes.
So let's see if I can do it. And so that's where you see the DAC starts getting interesting. And all the artifacts. I don't really want to create a sine tone that's like an analog sine tone, because I might as well do that using analog electronics. So you'll hear aliasing. You're into the world of the Nyquist limit and all these things I just fell asleep to when I was at university. Yeah, but you can hear it. Yeah, where it folds back on itself, and maybe you want to filter that out, or maybe you don't. Whether you want it to sound a little bit more like kind of chip tune, so the waveform isn't filtered as. So the DAC, the digital to analog converter, is quite a crucial part of the synthesis. Again, once you've actually been confronted with these things. And I think the limitation, because I've not just bought one off the shelf, because some microprocessors have built-in DACs, which are fantastic. So you might simply ask me, well, why don't you just buy one off the shelf? But by doing that, you then get into the design of the converter, and it becomes then a little bit more creative. I'll see if I can get the find the appropriate tone. This is the radical chip. If I had just a tone on here, we'd be able to hear this a bit easier. But I can now see. So yes, I've changed the capacitor on the DAC. That's a bigger cap. So that is simply one of the components in the resistor capacitor filter on the DAC. It comes literally out of the microchip through the resistor, through the cap, and you can hear it. To answer your question? Yeah. Yes.
Any question? Yeah. Sorry, Carlo, sorry.
Okay. There was a moment when I wasn't paying attention, and I heard, I thought hearing you say the words witchcraft electronics.
Oh, yes.
I'm obviously aware of switchcraft electronics, but I think you said witchcraft. So whose term was that? You mentioned
Maya
the name.
Verlaque. Maya Verlaque. She was at the Hague, and she's studied there. She's currently now teaching composition at the Conservatoire in Amsterdam. And I think the Hague School, if I can call them that, were very much thought of themselves as being on the periphery as a kind of, as an approach to making contemporary, in an approach to creating music.
So how do you write the name?
Yes, it's Naya Verlaak. Maya Verlaak.
V-E-R.
L-A-A. She's Belgian.
Just one more name question while we're doing
Yeah.
it. So, who was the person you said you interviewed who was part of the side?
Frida Naak, which is or Naak, how you might pronounce it. Naak, I suppose.
Okay, great.
Frida Naak.
Thanks.
It's an interesting. Although I think he tends to upset people. Yeah. He was a staunch Maoist. So, oh, John, don't go and speak to him. You'll never get out alive. But he was very nice. Very interesting, particularly in terms of code and programming and synthesis, but in the visual.
Casper had it.
Yeah, how are these pics that you use? Do you use a normal documentation that comes with them, or how do you approach programming these things? And
Yes.
is there a community of people that help with this?
So something like this, I would publish the code online
Yeah.
and write text about it. I've been doing fanzines. Do you know what a fanzine is? Which is like a what's the that's heretical. My boss tells me I should have more outputs for the research, and I tell him I want to produce a fanzine, which is like kind of DIY, sort of punk publication with a photocopier. And my next project is in Prague in June, and the idea to document the work is to have a live printing press where we will print some of the ideas in a little publication. I've made some printers, to be also interesting, and this is quite answering your question, with till receipt as well, which is a lot of fun. And writing about the synthesis or the ideas in the work, and it becomes then documented. You have to print it out on a certain type of printer. So I've tried to think of ways of engaging with the practice itself, also in the documentation. And I think I could do more. We all could probably do more with that, rather than simply how-to videos or demos. I think I have the license to be a little bit more creative. Don't get me wrong, we do need some demos online about how to do things, but I think I can document things in different ways. So like having more comments in the code, or doing...
No, but I guess also you maybe got inspired by, because I mean usually these chips are not used by people making music, I guess, and they're used for other things. So maybe you also got inspired by the more like the different kind of problems that... Yes,
Jamie Allen, he's another designer. He did a nice collection of code poetry. Jamie Allen, yeah, he works in Switzerland. I found that approach to coding fascinating, but nevertheless, for me, it still ends with sound. That does ultimately define me. Well, all the other stuff, yeah, you can have data, you can manage data, you can map. I've never been that interested in mapping. So, that's why I'm drawn to things like this, motors, because it's a very direct correlation between the action and the sound. So yes, ultimately, all that data out there, the wave tables. I mean, like an oscillator. I mean, there are so many different ways of reading a wave table. Or maybe there's a limit on how you can actually read a wave table. In terms of processes, backwards, randomly. I mean, we could come up with a long list of how you might read a wave table in terms of digital synthesis. Don't think I answered your question.
No, well, yeah, I was just curious. I mean, I have dealt with. I mean, I've bought actually a few of these chips, but I never got to program it because I thought, then I need to have a programmer and probably have to learn some weird assembly-like language. I don't know what is running.
Yes, I must admit, with the PIC 12F 1822, it was like the Wild West.
Yes. Which is
like all of us probably, we've become
yeah.
accustomed to going online, Googling it, and then thinking you'll get a how-to or some help. And then thinking, oh shit, nobody's done anything with this. Or if they have, they haven't told, I don't know what I'm going to do. So then you try and piece it together from other bits of information. But I think you either need a lot of time or that kind of attitude that you're going to
you
do.
You really want to have it, yeah. Okay, well,
and
part of the no free coffee anyway.
no free coffee. And the next thing is, for me, I will move on to another chip just to make it difficult.
Because,
the virtuosity is in the listening. That's also my mantra. And I'll put myself in a position of naivety and heresy by designing something almost like good or something that works, and then throwing it away and making another. Not because I'm wasteful, but it just keeps reducing me to that childish-like state.
First of all, thanks. You mentioned Trevor Richard. In my thoughts, is someone that maybe is busy with higher level process on the sound and things like that. And for me, it was really interesting that you are maybe in totally different world dealing with a very low level. Had you experienced something with the circuits that like process such a thing? Or for me, it was like you're really looking for very maybe dry sounds, things like having things very pure. But for me, it is totally opposite. It was really interesting for me to.
I had an interesting discussion about authenticity of synthesis or sound. That's a big, fascinating subject area. Nicholas Kenyon, he wrote a great book on authenticity in early music. But I think what is an authentic sound as well. But this is something I'm really excited about. But over a pint tonight, we can discuss my relationship with Trevor. He was my tutor. He was my referee. Got me a job. But I kind of, not personally, but intellectually, because he taught brilliant politics. I would go to his house, we'd have tea and talk interesting things. But then when it came to his music, sometimes he would just forget some of those things. The Composer's Desktop project, on the other hand, I was talking to Andrew about this last night, still was quite a statement. We were debating, this is an early command line, I haven't got time to get into this, but it's a fascinating project that Andrew also worked on, where his politics were more overt somehow. There's almost a moment there when he approached things differently. But yes, that, like I said, is a discussion over a pint beer. And how you end up coming to a different place. You can have the same tutor, the same route and branch off.
Yeah, for me, this was really interesting.
We had compositions, but where we would be crawling about on the floor. A lot of people say, a lot of your performances and sound making involves crawling about on the floor and making sound. And we used to do that with Trevor. And he was great. And some of his vocal improvisation, of course, was more in the kind of improvisatory spirit and more kind of open. So I don't know
But
where-
also his software programming, ever since this piece called Fabulous Paris,
Yes.
when he left behind this spectral processing and went for writing programs that actually work directly on the waveform.
Wavelength.
Yes, exactly. And from that point on, I mean, they're the kind of programs that, I mean, with no disrespect to engineers, but it's kind of not an engineer would never think of writing that kind of program, because it's so somehow so first principles, and you know, maybe it was a kind of a reaction in a way to the fact that the spectral thing that he'd been doing was was a very engineering thing, and of course it all came out from Richard Dawson's work originally with the phase vocoder and so on. But he went really in the opposite direction in terms of programming, the kind of programming he was doing. But essentially going back, and it was still on the voice, the human voice. And the things from Fabulous Paris onwards and all those pieces, two women, 4 voice prints, helped me a little bit with these pieces. The division of labour.
Yes, the latter pieces became a little bit more programmatic, didn't they? But that's just jumping at the spectralism. I think there is a distinction there. So I was talking about this microcomputer music manifesto. One of those lines is not primary concern of spectrum in synthesis. I mean, I was also brought up in a culture of electroacoustic music. You know, essentially, you could argue that's an extension of kind of spectralist thinking to sound. But maybe the synthesis, again, it's not all about the spectrum within the synthesis. And I think some of the things I'm pointing at here suggest a synthesis that isn't completely dominated by spectral thinking. I think there's possibly another interesting debate about that. Where Trevor, particularly, I think, in his earlier works, as Andrew was saying, very driven by this spectralist approach to sound.
But we are already 10 minutes over time now. We were on time, but can is it very quick or no? We're going to finish. I think we need the time for lunch.
Yes. Over lunch.
Now we have 50 minutes for lunch.
Yeah.
So we come back here at 1:30 for Tom's presentation. We'll try to keep to time and come back at 1:30. Thank you, John.
Yeah.
It is wonderful.